welcome to the program.
Thank you so much.
In December of 2009, a report is issued entitled Buried Evidence, Unknown, Unmarked, and Mass Graves in Indian-Administered Kashmir. This report is issued by the International People's Tribunal on Kashmir, of which you are a convener. What is the essence of the information that this report reveals?
In 2009, after 3 years of work that we had undertaken, we were able to uncover across Kashmir, just in 3 districts actually, there are 20 districts in Kashmir as you know. This was in 3 districts of Bandipora, Baramulla and Kupwara. And we were able to uncover over 2,900 bodies across 55 villages that were buried in 2,700 unknown, unmarked and mass graves in 62 sites across these villages. And these graves, often we did not know who they belonged to. What we knew is that they had been placed there, often at night, dragged, some with torture marks, many defaced, by the military, paramilitary and police in the state of Jammu and Kashmir. And local people were forced into digging the graves and burying them at great risk and trauma to themselves. And we found as well that there were about 49 graves bodies that we were able to get access to investigate who they were. And often these graves, the police would say that these belong to foreign terrorists that have come across the border from Pakistan to destabilize India. And of the 49, people were marked as terrorists. They were marked as foreign militants, for example. And when we were able to look at them and we were able to uncover what they were, we found that all of them in fact were local people. Not one was a foreigner. And of the 49, 48 of them were ordinary civilians and one was a local Kashmiri militant. So these bodies have been buried, I feel, under false pretenses as to initiate into the international and national imaginary the notion that the struggle in Kashmir is one that is constituted through foreign agency, through foreign memory and imaginary, and that it is not local, the struggle for freedom in Kashmir. And I feel that our report, Buried Evidence, what it did was to demystify, to unmask who the bodies were that had been buried there.
In King Lear, Kent asks, is this the promised end? And Edgar responds, or image of that horror. I'm wondering about graves as a metaphor for something much larger here.
Yes. I think graves, what I have learned is that, and this was heartbreaking because sometimes when I would be walking to document those graves, one would find oneself standing on one, and I didn't know that that was what it was. And sitting with local people to talk, what they said is that these graves are our counter-memory. They destabilize the official narrative of the state. These graves are our history. These graves tell the story of Kashmir. These graves contain the bodies of those that have died simply because they disobeyed what the state wanted them to become. I think there's Atta Muhammad, who is a gravedigger man in his 70s, quite amazing. And he had said to me that the bodies he had buried 203 graves between 2002 and 2006. And he had said to me that, the bodies that I have buried, they appear and reappear in my dreams in graphic and gruesome detail. And he said that until he could actually offer his testimony in a sense to acknowledge that he had lived through this trauma, he had stopped dreaming. There are others who have testified and said they had stopped dreaming in Kashmiri. this, to be able to vocalize what had happened to them, was in fact a way of actually saying, look, this happened. My memory, Atta Muhammad tells me, is my contribution. And then he says, I am so tired. I'm so tired because I've tried to remember all of this. And as you so well know, David, that in any context of intense subjugation, long drawn out oppression, one of the things that hinges, that determines who is winning, is whose memory is out there, whose memory is triumphant, so to speak. And I think that what I've learned through the work in Kashmir is that the memory of a people, what the Indian state has tried to do through its militarization, is to suppress it, is to not acknowledge it, is to render it invalid, and to displace that with the memory of the Kashmiri as an enemy, the Kashmiri as not trustworthy, the Kashmiri as violent, the Kashmiri always as someone that we need to be suspicious to if we are to be good citizen subjects, if we are to be patriots. We must understand. And of course, who is the Kashmiri? The Kashmiri is the Muslim. The Kashmiri is India's nemesis, the other, the Muslim. Yes.
I notice in buried evidence that you have here a preliminary report. So this was issued 2 years ago. Have you followed up on the documentation?
Yes. We would like to have respite from all the little roadblocks and checkpoints that our lives become embroiled in, so we could do more of this work. But we've had people come to us with lists of graves, graveyards, names, details that have just been sent to us to investigate, and we've actually been accumulating that and collecting that. And as you know, this year in July, the State Human Rights Commission of the government of Jammu and Kashmir came out with its report that corroborated and authenticated the findings in buried evidence, which was huge in the sense that this is the first time that the government has acknowledged, therefore, the existence of unknown, unmarked and mass graves. And we've given them some of this information to say that you should actually expand your investigation to include all the 20 districts in Jammu and Kashmir, because it is our assumption that the number of graves would coincide with the number of people that have disappeared. And in Kashmir, there are over 8,000 people that are disappeared.
Buried evidence mentions encounter killings. What are encounters?
Encounters are very peculiar to South Asia. An encounter killing, or they're also known as fake encounters, fake encounter killings, what I would characterize as extrajudicial killings, where people have usually under false pretenses been killed by the state forces and implicated as what they are not. So often innocent people, or often people who were involved in some other skirmish, would be taken in, they would be held sometimes in custody, and they wouldn't be killed right away either. There are some cases where they've been taken into custody, they've been abused, and then when they're being transferred from one point to another point, they've been killed, and it's been posed as, no, he was killed, that person died when he came at us with bullets, guns, etc. And mysteriously there's always all this documentation of a little card on which is his name. Now why does the man not know his own name? Why is he carrying a card with a little name tag, name of his village, and then they say there's currency that they've discovered, all of this. But fake encounters essentially are extrajudicial killings where the state forces manufacture evidence to strengthen their story. And last year in April, if you recall, in 2010, there were fake encounter killings, 3 of them in Marchil, which later were authenticated as innocent civilians.
What was the response, first of all, to buried evidence from the Indian state, Indian civil society, and then the so-called international community and the United Nations? Let's start with the Indian state.
I think, predictably, sadly, and predictably, to ignore it. And we had a lot of people on our behalf, without even our asking, from parliamentarians to human rights groups such as Human Rights Watch or Amnesty International, who raised this with the Indian government, saying, look, this has come out what do you think? I know that within 5 days of the report coming out, these human rights organizations had gone to the Home Ministry saying, look, what about this? And the response was nothing, just nothing was the response. However, from what I've understood, or what I've been given to understand, is that agencies of the state were quite perturbed by it. And I think that eventually led to the State Human Rights Commission and its investigations. And I also know that there have been groups that have worked quite hard to disprove and discredit what we have done. And they haven't been able to, which, is excellent. But I think the response of Indian civil society, I've lost a lot of friends since working on the issue of Kashmir in India, which is heartbreaking. I think people's latent nationalism sadly asserts itself, and people are unable to distinguish between the gross violations of rights, the crimes against humanity, the human rights abuses that are put in place in order to continue the militarization, in order to hold Kashmir bondage to India. And people are unable to look at it from a distance as this is happening to Kashmiris, how should we react? Rather than this is happening to something we think is integral to India, how should we react? I think that distinction often people are unable to make. But I was actually quite encouraged by, civil society responses in terms of leaders of communities, social movement leaders, even in terms of the press, hesitant at first, but I felt the report would be quite ignored and disregarded, and it wasn't. And so people that I had sort of started, they were very skeptical that I was working in Kashmir and treated me as a traitor. These were people who came around to say, my God, so this must be really serious. And people didn't know about this. That's the other staggering part. So I think it helped in Indian society, it helped demystify the assumption created by the dominant media and the state that Kashmiris are violent, and it's to protect India and to protect Kashmiris from themselves, to protect Kashmiri women from Kashmiri men, for example, that the army and paramilitary, all 671,000 of them, have been put in place. I think amongst the international, and as you know, that first when I started working on this in 2008, the Kashmir police charged me with seditious actions, and the editor of the paper that published the article as well on the graves, he unfortunately lost his job in all of this mess.
Was that Greater Kashmir?
No, that was Etalat.
Etalat,
and this
the
was
Urdu paper.
Absolutely, and this was the English version of it. It came out both in English and Urdu, and had published in English. And this was Zahiruddin, who's also one of the conveners of the tribunal, yes. And Pervez Imroz had a grenade thrown at his home. Khurram Pervez has been sort of relentlessly surveilled. I've been detained at immigration every time, actually, when I go to India.
These are all conveners of the International People's Tribunal.
Yes, absolutely. Khurram Pervez is its liaison, but yes, and then Gautam Navlakha, another convener and noted intellectual in Delhi, he was barred from entering Kashmir this summer, and then he was allowed to go just recently, we found out again, but he was barred then. But the European Parliament, the Subcommittee on Human Rights, in July of 2008, I testified there, this is well before buried evidence, when we had preliminary investigations, and they passed a resolution which had the Indian government be livid, rightly so, I imagine, but be livid. And then we had an early day motion introduced in the United Kingdom Parliament. We've had every newspaper from the New York Times to the Guardian to papers in Africa, papers in the Middle East, papers in East Asia, to almost every noted paper in India carry it, and it's been quite amazing. And I think it bears testimony to the fact that maybe the world still can be disturbed.